Hey guys, this is miicrow. I wanted to do a high-level overview of how war comps will be structured with this up-and-coming patch. This by all means is not like a finalized roster, but I think will be a decent introduction for people who have not played in a war, because there's going to be a lot more wars played since territories will be constantly bedecked, and there's not going to be this downtime where territories are not declared due to the new influence system. And because of that, I think it's a good time to kind of get into introduction with this. This video is going to be more focused on the macro, not the specific micro of each group. Macro being the big picture, micro being how you're individually going to influence and impact what the general objective is. We're just going to talk about the objective in this video, or otherwise known as macro, and kind of get into that from there. So the base structure for this is you have 2-point groups, you have 4 quad groups, which each play on a quadrant of the point. You have 2 flex groups which rotate around, but more so play in your back line than your front line. And then you have 2 range groups which support your front line with range damage. Typically there's like kind of frontal groups, and then there's groups that play behind that front. Those frontal groups will be a little more tanky than the groups that play behind the front line, and the roster is reflecting that accordingly. With this setup, we have even groups for both the group numbers and for what I'm labeling them as in terms of point, quad, flex, or range playing on the right side, and odds playing on the left. So that's like fairly easy to understand. You can do tactics with this, and you could stack one side with more groups, you could stack one side with less groups so that you can bait people in, but this is like just a base comp strategy, so I'm not going to get into advanced things with that. So starting off here with some changes, we have the point team. The point team's objective is to be on point as long as possible. They are trying to create influence on the objective, and by creating influence, it will force the other team to respond. If you're on attack, if you're on defense, it will prevent the other team from getting that passive tick percent. The quad groups also will default to playing on point, but they will need to control the space around the point as well, so they kind of float between point and off point, versus the point groups typically just stay on point at all times. There are times where the point groups get off the point, because point groups typically play in the very, very front of the point, and they can infiltrate the other team's backline and then kind of bounce back and forth, but that's like more of a niche thing. But their surface level objective is just to stay on point at all times. If they can't stay on point, like if they have to decide between dying and staying on point, they'll obviously get off point, but they should be on point for roughly 80 to 90% of the entire war. These groups typically are slotted as a heavy SNS player, 3 Great Axe Warhammers, and 3 IGVGs with the current patch. But I believe this is going to change, and we're going to see flails be used up in the slot there. There is a discussion of, do you go flail VG, do you go IGVG, do you go flail IG? I think all these builds belong in sort of a different role. Great Axe Warhammer is losing a lot of its utility due to the stun effects basically being negated by flail, and a lot of the kind of CC being negated by flail in general, because flail grants basically an immunity through Arcane Vortex's flailing stability passive, which all allies within 3 meters of that vortex that get cast are going to get cleansed of CC effects, so root, stuns, and slows, and will be immune to them for 2 seconds, and that can scale up to 6 seconds. So all those slow effects, all those stun effects, all those root effects will basically be gone, allowing you to move very, very quickly throughout the point, which is previously not possible. Stuns are still going to be somewhat impactful, but I think will be less impactful overall, so hence dropping the amount of Warhammers in this point group. And I think flail will be kind of a must-have to have in as many spaces as possible due to the weapon just being very, very strong. So that's why I think you need 2 of those. You could go for like a heavy VG flail, but the problem I foresee with that is heavy IG VG right now can basically go infinite with magnetic gauntlets, and dropping those oblivions will cleanse that flail passive, allowing your Great Axe Warhammers to actually stun. Because you can go infinite with your cooldown reduction and just go for those continuous orbs, I don't think you're going to have much uptime on a flail, hence why I would go for an Ice Gauntlet as a secondary weapon for those classes, so that they're able to go infinite, but feel safe, because they're always going to be able to pull out that Ice Gauntlet to live if they need to do so, versus flail will allow you to live, but it's a little bit less tanky still than Ice Gauntlet is at the current moment. The heavy SNS flail, the gambit here, typically this is a heavy SNS IG, But the trick with the flail is with the human shield passive, that passive will continue to apply even when you swap to your SNS, so you can get that human shield passive off, reduce the damage of an ally, swap to your SNS for a bit, shield all your allies and go back, swap to flail, use an ability, get that passive off, you kind of juggle back and forth, allowing you to have very high uptime on all the flail abilities and on the SNS abilities, while providing maximum fortify and tankiness basically to your allies on point. There is a possibility, honestly, to run 2 of these on the point and drop one of the flail IGs. I could very easily foresee that because the human shield passive seems so strong, and without that heavy SNS slot, I don't think human shield is going to be used a ton because the other abilities on the flail are just too strong. But that would require your IGL or your in-game lead, which will likely be on heavy flail because it's a very tanky build, to be very proficient with it and to get maximum utility out of those flail cleanses and that vortex, because no one else is going to have the vortex. So that would require some proficiency there that I don't believe many IGLs have at the current moment. So I don't foresee that being a thing that's slotted very much. You also should have an AoE healer on point. The focus of the AoE healer should be pumping AoEs where the sword and shield is, because that's where your tank is and that's where the army should play around. Your group healers also heal the groups, and everything there is kind of set in stone more or less, besides what the Great Axe Warhammer slots are, what the Flail IG slots are, and how many IG VGs you want. But there are 4 slots in there that are basically set in stone in terms of the group heals, the AoE heal, the heavy SNS flail, and then everything else can be a little bit interchangeable depending on what players your army has. But the main goal here is to have very tanky players on the point that can live given a lot of damage incoming to them, while also providing utility for your army as a whole for people that play near the point and step on the point. Moving on to your quadrants here. Your odd quadrants are the quadrants that are going to be playing near the top of the objective, or sorry, your quadrant 1 and your quadrant 2 are going to be the quadrants that are playing near the top of the objective. So these are built a little bit more tanky. That's why they have flail IGs in there. Those flail IGs are going to be able to disrupt people with their amount of staggers, because flail's arcane smite has a stagger built into it. The trip ability has a stagger built into it, and just overall allows you to do maximum staggers without sacrificing much utility. I could put the flail build up on the screen, but I had it wrong here originally. You typically want to go for passives like Oppressive Advantage, because that will allow you to have a very, very big haste-like effect. And other passives like Mitigated Protection are also important to juggle, but they are a little bit more tricky to get off consistently. The main goal here with the flail is just to provide maximum uptime for deflecting fertility from Arcane Smite and flying stability. You should be trying to get to 200 focus, trying to get to 350 con, and trying to get to 50 strength, in my opinion, to have decent damage, a high buff uptime, and be tanky at all times. For the medium IGVG slot, these will be running the Magnetic Gauntlets. They'll basically be going infinite in terms of how many Oblivions they're going to be pumping out. They're going to be getting ult charged super, super fast. Very likely that these will move on from using Vines to something like a Bile, because most people will be immune to Vines because of the flails being prevalent. And Bile just will provide better utility. The alternative could also be Cleansing Firestorm, which will allow people to not be affected by dot effects, and it seems like there's a lot of dot effects right now, so that may be a good thing to go. The light Fire Staff Ice Gauntlets, these will be using the new Ice Gauntlet artifact that has not been revealed completely yet, but we have seen data mines of for, which I believe will be there when the expansion actually comes out. We believe this is likely locked behind a main story quest, which is why it was not in the PTR, because they limited the progression on the main story quest for the PTR. But this Ice Gauntlet will allow you to do 15% increased damage to targets that are either rooted or under some sort of Ice Gauntlet effect. So this will allow you to use Ice Spike very effectively. This will just boost your ice damage overall, and will lead to an increased amount of damage per second from the Fire Staff and from the Ice Gauntlet, and will allow you to go sort of an Ice Gem with the Fire Staff and negate any fire resistance, or much of the fire resistance that will be prevalent in this upcoming meta. Moving on to Group 3, some of these builds you may have seen in OPR a little bit. They're a little bit newer. A Great Axe Warhammer, the main idea with all these Great Axe Warhammers is to use the Mjolnir like Warhammer. This Warhammer allows you to apply a 50% weaken. Wrecking Ball seems to have gotten a pretty serious animation nerf, so it's a lot harder to get out of that animation, provide a consistent uptime with it, and it seems like this kind of passive from Wrecking Ball is just not worth it anymore. Instead, when we look at the Warhammer, we should probably be going for Mighty Gavel with that new Warhammer, which will allow you to apply that 50% weaken and just shut down damage. Basically, Great Axe Warhammer has moved from this damage per second roll to this more supportive weaken utility roll, and because of that, the Warhammer is going to be changed to reflect that. Light Great Axe Ice Gauntlet, this entire build is just built on nuking. You go into clumps, you blow up the clumps. The new Great Axe seems to do tons of damage, so if it's released in its current state, it's just going to be played for a lot of these safer groups that can go into clumps, blow them up, and then kind of retreat. But it's not going to be able to have a high uptime in a clump because you are in light, and I don't imagine people are going to want to go medium with 350 int, because this will probably be a 350 int, a 25 strength, and the rest will be thrown into con. So it's like, it's enough con, but you don't have grit, so you're just not going to want to be in a clump for long periods of time. A medium flail VG, this is like a hybrid between IG VG and flail IG. Both of them seem to be viable, but medium flail VG seems a little bit less tanky in my opinion, so I would suggest putting it in like one of those back quad groups. You could still have good uptime with your VG when you want to, you could have good uptime with your flail when you want to, but you have to know when to juggle between the two, and that part's a little bit more difficult. You will be a little bit more squishy, but you are plenty tanky with the flail. You should be able to survive with this class with no problem. You're not going to be going much into the int with the spec, you're still going to be playing for that flail like spec where you have a lot of con, you have a lot of focus. You can maybe drop the con a little bit if you want to, if you play more passive, but your main utility here is just providing that AoE, a heal from the flail at times, and all those buffs from the flail that just make the flail so prevalent in OPRs, the current state of the game. Light BBIG will be used to support the back of the clumps. You have an Ice Gauntlet there in the back now, so that will allow people to be caught if they infiltrate your backline. The BBIG will be the build that's blowing them up. BBIGs, I suspect, will be running a very glass cannon setup with either 350 int 100 strength and 150 con, or 350 int 200 strength and 50 con. One of those two is probably going to be meta. Very, very glass cannon, but they're in a safe spot in your backline. They will not be punished for it very often, and will be able to blow up people very, very effectively because they are running so little con and so many DPS stats in other categories. Moving on to the flex groups here, we have medium SNS flails. These are kind of a unique spec that I don't think has been tested a lot, but will likely be played just because the shield synergy between the flail and the SNS. You probably still want to flail in most of your groups. This is going to be where those groups are slotted. These groups are rotating around the sword and shield. You will be used as leadership to kind of buff people. The flail will be used more so for the right tree, unlike most of these other builds. So you're going to be going for that human shield passive to try to protect your healers, who are likely just going to be yoinked by the Roadhog-esque build of Spear Blunderbuss that has taken over a lot of OPRs in the current PTR, that is used to pull people 12 meters into your team and just blow them up immediately. And that flail with SNS is one of the only builds that can kind of help those healers get out alive, and because of that, it is probably going to be slotted in these flex groups where people are most likely going to be vulnerable to being hooked by this Roadhog-esque build. Light Great Axe Warhammer is there to blow up clumps. This Great Axe, if you are not familiar, it's called the Abyss. It scales off of int, which is why you're playing with the Ice Gauntlet and why you're running that spec that I was talking about earlier. Does very, very high damage. It's probably the highest damage weapon in the game per stat that's allocated, and just overall just drops nukes on people. It seems like it can blow up clumps single-handedly as long as you pop a cleanse pot before, and it just is super, super strong even as a solo build to wipe clumps. And if you time it together with another Light Great Axe Ice Gauntlet, there's nothing that can stand in your way. You're probably going to delete everyone that's in a certain area of the objective. Light Firestaff Ice Gauntlet's going to be using that spec I talked about earlier. Nothing is too different there. Moving on to the range groups, Musket VG, if you have not played the PTR OPR, can hit for about 10 to 15k if built correctly per shot, which is why it's very likely going to be hard meta until that is tuned down. If it is tuned down, which I think is fairly likely because a lot of people have been complaining about it, it might not be that OP, but at the current state of the game, it seems like this build is just going to be hard meta and will ruin a lot of people's days. Light Spear with bow, the idea here is you drop your like your survivability with the rapier, you gain the spear, and then you could pull people in with that scorpion sting, similar utility to the Roadhog S build with blunderbuss. But here you're trying to pull people in to set them up to be deleted by the muskets, and bow still does a decent amount of damage, so bow can do some stuff there as well. There is a bow artifact will be interesting if people try to run that instead of the spear artifact, but I think the spear artifact's a little bit better. Maybe people do a combination of both, but this bow artifact that has not been officially revealed yet but has been data mined will stun people that are full HP for half a second. There is an amulet that will extend that to a 1 second stun, but it can only apply one for 1 second between activation, so you can't just rain of arrows a clump on point and stun 15 people. That will not work. It will only stun one person. But that is another build that could be run here instead of a bow spear, and that would likely be run with either a rapier or a hatchet. I just think the spear is such good value because it's basically if you hit that javelin, that person is dead in this kind of setup. So I think that will be run more so than the lightning bow that will just stun people, but time will tell. At the end of the day, all these builds are kind of viable. We have a total count here of the amount of builds. If you look at this, there is a lot of build diversity that is built into this army, and I suspect that this will be the case of the up-and-coming patch, which is very, very cool and unique. There's not typically this amount of build diversity, but it seems that way, or seems to lean that way. There's also a possibility for healers to drop that rapier and go for flail. It seems like it's survivable enough to be run as a secondary, and if that is the case, some of these slots may change. There might be slightly less flail, slightly more IGVGs kind of being run in rosters, maybe some more Great Axe Warhammers being run in rosters if those healers could actually maintain uptime on the flail. But I'm not betting on that personally because I haven't seen many healers flex off the rapier for the entire duration of New World, and the game's been out for 2-ish years, so I don't believe that healers are flexible enough to do that at the current moment, and I'm looking forward to be proven wrong by people. But until that is proven wrong, I'm going to assume that healers will still be running rapier, still be running stone form, still be running everything defensive that they possibly can to try to live as long as possible and not be going for the utility that the flail provides. So this comp is very, very centric on running a lot of Ice Gauntlets too. It looks like we cut a lot of Ice Gauntlet slots, but we added in a lot of Ice Gauntlet slots from other builds that are typically not played right now, so you still maintain a very high amount of Ice Gauntlets. Ice Gauntlets are very important for showers, which prevent people from running through chokes for free, and can kind of set up people to be killed more so than most other weapons. That being said, if someone has the flailing stability buff, they can just run through an ice shower without any consequence, so I don't think ice showers are going to be as important as people think they will be. And there's a potential for some of those Ice Gauntlet builds to swap over to something else with more stagger potential, like a spear or a warhammer, but time will tell if that is the case. There is still a good amount of healers. I think 11 is the amount of healers that everyone's kind of settled on for every single meta, and I don't think that will likely change. There are less Great Axes, there are a little bit less Void Gauntlets, but still a lot of Void Gauntlets. There are less Warhammers, but again, Warhammer is basically hard countered by the flail, which is why I think there will be less Warhammers overall. There are a good amount of spears, good amount of blunderbuss, good amount of fire staffs, etc. Oh, I forgot to put in the flail here. Yeah, we got 9 flails. So still a good amount of flails overall. Should be pretty happy with that because flail seems to be one of the best weapons in terms of utility, but you don't want so many that you're overlapping with other people. So it seems like a good balance to me, but we'll see how this meta kind of shakes out in the future. I wanted to compare this to like the old meta, just to give a reference point of like how this looks. I have like a sample old meta roster on the left. You can see there's a lot less build diversity with the older meta compared to the newer one. There's a lot more Great Axe Warhammers. There's very much so a lot of the slots are just kind of set in stone, which is why there is a lot less build diversity overall. And Great Axe Warhammer is just kind of very prevalent because it gets stun people all the time and do high DPS. I don't believe this is going to remain the case for too long, which is why a flail because of flail, so that's going to be the development I suspect, but it will take time because a lot of these Great Axe Warhammer slots will either need to be eliminated as players will not be able to participate in war, or they'll need to adapt and play other builds, most likely because flail more or less counters their build. That being said, even though we are dropping Great Axe Warhammers, we are adding in Great Axe Ice Gauntlets, so there will still be plenty of opportunity for these players to play. So in reality, we go from 13 Great Axe Warhammers to about 10, which I don't think is that bad of a trade-off. You could add in like 1 or 2 more from the flex groups potentially, instead of like the SNS flail setup, or maybe the spear blunderbuss is like kind of too quirky for some people, or firestaff ice gauntlet doesn't do enough. That's a spot that could be used for that, or the bow spear slot maybe could be used for that, but I don't think that is likely the case, and this will likely be the meta that we will foresee, or something like this. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know if there's some build that you think I missed that will likely be slotted here. I didn't talk about a lot of the artifacts in this video, but in terms of where groups will be playing, there will be groups on the top point, groups on the sides, groups a little bit further back, and we'll see a similar motion to wars, I imagine, to the current setup, but there will be a lot more mobility and a lot more movement due to the flail, allowing you to just run through clumps and not be touched by slowing based effects. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in the next video.